Executive Director of the Institute for Responsible Technology. My second book, Genetic Roulette, the documented health risks of genetically engineered foods, was the first compilation of the health dangers. And my latest movie, Genetic Roulette, is also the most popular movie on GMOs, and I'd like to be able to give a copy to each member of the council. It's been seen by more than 2 million people. I've spoken in over 37 countries and testified around the world. And as I speak to different governments and regulators, I see one of the key aspects of GMOs is a kind of an epidemic of the thinking that someone else must be taking care of it. Someone else is doing a good job. It's not our responsibility. And the most blatant example of this was with the FDA itself. The scientists at the FDA, we now know from memos made public from a lawsuit, were deeply concerned about the health dangers and said these crops need to be tested carefully for food safety. There's unique diseases or problems that can occur, allergens, toxins, problems eating milk or meat from animals fed GMOs. There should be long-term studies, human studies, etc. But the political appointee in charge of policy at the FDA, Michael Taylor, Monsanto's former attorney, who was placed in that position after the FDA was instructed to promote biotechnology, his policy said, we don't see any difference between GMOs and non-GMOs to be concerned with, so no testing is necessary, no labeling is necessary. And so that is the official position of the United States, not based on science or scientists, but based on politics and economics. And as I travel around the world, other countries figure, well, the FDA approved it, so they must have done studies, etc. It turns out the FDA does no studies. In fact, they allow Monsanto to do studies, and we've caught Monsanto red-handed rigging their research. It's basically tobacco science. And when individual independent scientists discover problems, they're automatically attacked. This was written up in Nature. It's well known. No matter what the evidence is found against GMOs, it's immediately, quote, discredited from a series of biotech proponents around the world, who then say that there's consensus around the world that this has been discredited. Now, the American Academy of Environmental Medicine, which first identified food allergies, Gulf War syndrome, chemical sensitivity, and more than a dozen other new things afflicting the U.S. population, did an evaluation of the animal feeding studies on GMOs in 2009 and said there's so much evidence of damage to the rats and mice that were fed GMOs, gastrointestinal problems, immune system problems, organ damage, reproductive disorders, accelerated aging, etc., that every doctor should prescribe non-GMO diets to every patient, and the government should impose a moratorium. There are now thousands of physicians and other healthcare professionals prescribing non-GMO diets, and I have had the pleasure of hearing more reports from them and from consumers who've switched off of GMOs than anyone in the world. And I can say that when I first started hearing this, I was extremely skeptical, because having represented dozens of scientists for so many years, I was like, this is anecdotal evidence. We don't have clear controlled studies. There's potential cofactors. But I hear over and over again the same disorders and diseases that the lab animals were afflicted from getting better in humans that are taking GMOs out of their diet, and sometimes within 2 or 3 days. But an even more telling anecdotal story is what we hear from livestock farmers and veterinarians who take animals off of GM soy or corn and put them on non-GM soy or corn and notice dramatic differences, again, in these same sets of diseases and disorders. Furthermore, if you look at the correlational evidence, we see a rise of these same disorders and diseases in the U.S. population since GMOs were introduced. And then if you look at the two main toxins associated with GMOs, the Bt toxin produced in corn and cotton, which is now found to poke holes in human cells. It gets through somehow into the blood supply, because a Canadian published study shows it's in the blood of 80% of the unborn fetuses of pregnant women, and in 93% of the pregnant women themselves. The Bt toxin characteristics of possibly creating permeable gut and being an allergen, the characteristics of Roundup, which is sprayed on most of the genetically engineered crops, how it chelates, it's linked to cancer, it's an endocrine disruptor, it chelates nutrients, making them unavailable. If you look at the characteristics of these two toxins, they would predispose individuals to the same disorders that are afflicting lab animals, that doctors say are getting better in their patients, that veterinarians are saying are getting better in their livestock, and that are on the rise in the U.S. population since GMOs were introduced. Now, we can look at just the peer-reviewed published studies, but I think we're now evolved past that because so many people are living examples. Now, one of the issues is that as people learn about the dangers and they realize no one is protecting them, even the USDA, when it was analyzed by its own inspector general, they were basically condemned, saying they're doing outdoor field trials with no real safeguard for contamination into the environment, into non-GMO relatives or the same crop just downwind. And we see now the results of that catastrophe, where it was $1 billion problem when we found genetically engineered rice had contaminated the long grain rice supplies in the United States. And it was years and years after that illegal variety had been field trialed. Same with the wheat. In Oregon, the last time they field trialed Roundup Ready wheat was in 2001. It was just found in Oregon in a field, and we lost the exports for a long time to South Korea and Japan. Now, those of us who are aware of pollen spreading and the encroachment of nature, for example, when there's a volcano and it causes a complete wipeout of the flora in an area, you can look on the mountain and say, oh, that's from 18-something, that's from 19-something. Everyone in Hawaii is aware of the spread of nature. In fact, Hawaii itself was pure lava rock. Now it's a lush tropical paradise. Where did it get those seeds? Nature has a way of expanding beyond its boundaries, and everyone who's connected with nature understands that, except possibly the biotech industry, who told us over and over again there would be no contamination and coexistence is possible. And then they allow states to put in field trials with no possible way for the state to even evaluate the contamination, because the state is not privy to the specific traits that they're putting into the state land. So there could be massive contamination that no one knows about till years later. And when it's planted in the soil and then sprayed with Roundup, Roundup kills the beneficial bacteria in the soil, the bacteria that make nutrients more available to the soil. It promotes fungal pathogens. Dr. Don Huber, a Roundup expert formerly from Purdue University, he pointed out that more than 40 plant diseases are on the rise in the U.S. agriculture because of the use of Roundup. And of course, we have the Roundup-resistant weeds. And so Roundup is changing the face of agriculture. It compactifies the soil. And if you look at a Roundup-ready cropland next to a natural cropland after a rain, there's more puddles in the Roundup-ready cropland because the soil does not absorb as well. So you have a whole change in the ecosystem. Then you have the Bt toxin, which is exuded in the roots of the corn and cotton. It binds with clay to remain active for months or years. It can be washed into streams where it can affect the life of the caddisfly, which is part of the marine ecosystem. So we're talking about irreversible or long-term damage. Long-term in terms of the soil microbiota, and permanent in terms of the pollution of the gene pool. There's one thing that lasts longer than pollution of the gene pool, and that's extinction. The genes already released can outlast the effects of global warming and nuclear waste because it's a self-propagating genetic pollution. Now, in closing, I want to say I'm not against genetic engineering as a science per se. When I talk to scientists around the world who are independent of the biotech industries that make money from this technology, they generally agree that the technology was released long before the science was ready. But you have patents that expire, and return on investment, which has its own time requirements. So if it actually would have taken 50 or 100 or 150 years of understanding the DNA before we released this, that was simply not compatible with the economic models of the biotech industry. And so we have models, or a generation of GMOs, which are based on assumptions which have long since proven wrong. And we still hear that people are saying, well, someone must have looked at it. Japan must have assessed it. The FDA must have assessed it. The university must have assessed it. When you look back, you find it's actually the biotech industry using short-term studies designed to avoid finding problems. And when long-term studies are implemented, they jump on them and call them discredited. So I really appreciate the efforts by this council to take responsibility, to pick up the slack where others have dropped it. Obviously, the FDA should have looked at it more carefully, should have required the studies that the scientists, their own scientists, by consensus demanded. But in their lack of attention, in the USDA lack of attention, I'm glad to see states and regions stepping up, like San Juan Islands that voted to ban the planting of GMOs, Mendocino County, Marin County, the county council in Santa Cruz, the county council in Trinity County banned the planting of GMOs because they did not want to suffer the consequences of this immature science, which is known to promote side effects. So I'm happy to answer questions and back up anything I've said. What I did not cover is a long list of peer-reviewed published studies, which I think would have taken too much time during this brief testimony, but I'm happy to respond to those points as well.
Thank you very much. Councilmember Ford, you still have the floor.
I'm going to yield to allow anyone else to ask questions, and then I'll finish up. Thank you.
Councilmember Elegant.
Aloha, Mr. Smith, or is it
Aloha.
Dr. Smith?
No, Jeffrey's fine.
Well, Mr. Smith, I have a question for you. Have you ever heard of the rainbow papaya?
Oh yes, I'm very aware of it.
What's the difference between the rainbow papaya and GM wheat? Or any other?
Well, if we talk about the genetically engineered papaya, it uses a double-stranded RNA technology, which is the subject of a couple of recent studies. And the double-stranded RNA technology is such that they take a piece of RNA, which then influences the expression of DNA. The assumption had been they would only affect the papaya and no one else or nothing else. But even in the USDA's own study, it turns out that the double-stranded RNA can impact the gene expression of wildlife and human beings. So there was a study that was released by Dr. Jack Heinemann and Dr. Judy Carman, published, and showed that the evaluation of this technology is sorely inadequate to protect against environmental problems and human health problems, and the papaya was one example cited in that study. I also spoke to virologist Dr. Jonathan Latham about...
Could I sum up what you just said so I could understand? So you're saying that that gene is spreading, whatever gene that got modified in the rainbow papaya is being transferred to other species? Is that what I'm hearing?
Not transferred, although we do know that genes can transfer to the DNA of gut bacteria, according to Nature Biotechnology 2004 study.
I'm not a scientist. Could you please, let's say, simplify it for me?
Okay, all right. So there's two things. In a study done in the UK, they found that the gene that was inserted into soybeans to make the soybeans Roundup ready.
GM papaya.
No, but well, you asked about the transfer of genes.
No, I'm asking about
the papaya.
Papaya. And what's the difference between that?
So the gene inserted into the papaya creates two things. It creates RNA and it creates proteins. And so it turned out that when it was created, everyone figured the RNA was safe. The short answer is we now know that that RNA, when consumed by human beings, might switch on or shut off our genes. It's a theoretical possibility that has never been evaluated. The proteins, which had assumed to be safe, it turns out more than 100 peer-reviewed studies have shown that viral proteins can interfere with organisms' viral defenses. In short, in other words, eating papaya that's genetically engineered might cause you to get more colds, more susceptibility to hepatitis or HIV. And again, these are completely backed with peer-reviewed published studies, but we can only say might. The reason why we can only say might, there hasn't been any animal feeding studies on the papaya, certainly no human feeding studies. We've heard only anecdotal evidence of people getting sick in relationship to eating papaya every day. I would discount that until a wider study is done, but it's an example of a technology where when it was introduced, they had the assumption that the protein was safe, they had the assumption that the RNA was safe, and now we know through the most cutting-edge science that we can't make that assumption, and we've actually put the population at risk.
So I think we all understand that might is really what we're trying to figure out, because this might do this might do that. And as a person who can't predict the future, we try to do our best to make that law so we preserve this island. And we're trying to figure out what GM products might do. And from what I'm understanding, you are saying is that even scientifically, it's hard to even answer that. There's really no certainty. I mean, I understand that because everything is pretty much uncertain. So I wanted to ask you, the protein. You said that the protein might have a viral impact with us, so the protein is different from the organic or conventional papayas.
Yes.
Okay. And what makes it so different that it might affect our health?
Because what they do is they have a viral piece, let's say, of DNA. So it produces what we can call a viral protein. Now, viral proteins are well known to have certain effects, two main classes of effects. One is they work in conjunction with viruses to make the viruses more infectable. So it suppresses the defenses against viral infection.
So, Mr. Smith, are you saying there is a bad protein and good protein? Because you're saying that the protein in the rainbow papaya is worse than the protein in a conventional papaya. How is it that protein is worse off than the conventional? Is there like a bad protein or a good protein?
So let's define terms here, but thank you for that question. When we talk about like protein in meat, we're just thinking about all the different proteins there added up, and they, create strong bodies, whatever. When we talk about genes, like there's 23,000 genes in the human genome, and they produce 100 or 200,000 different proteins. These proteins can be enzymes. These proteins have different qualities. So I'm only talking about the inserted gene into the papaya produces a strand of RNA, and that strand of RNA may produce a protein that has characteristics of a viral protein, a protein produced from viruses. And when I spoke to a virologist, Dr. Jonathan Latham, he said that the approval of this completely overlooked a huge bank of peer-reviewed published studies. It never evaluated to see if the protein that was added to the papaya that had never before been in a Hawaiian papaya or any papaya, if it might be something that would suppress our immune system against viral infections, or possibly interfere with things like the cell cycle, which might lead to cancer. So these things were not simply theoretical, let's think of all the possible things that can go wrong. No, this was a well understood body of research. Over 100 studies show that proteins produced from viruses can do this. But when this was approved in Hawaii, no one considered that. Likewise, you asked earlier to the previous guest, is there any other changes in the nutrients of a genetically engineered crop. Well, in the U.S., we don't do a thorough analysis, but sometimes after a product is already approved, independent scientists showed, for example, that there's a reduction in the amount of protein in Roundup Ready soybeans, that there's an increase in an anti-nutrient that blocks the absorption of nutrients. There's a known allergen, which is as much as 7 times higher. There's a new allergen in Monsanto's corn. These are part of what I call the collateral damage that occurs as a result of the process of genetic engineering. So far, I think all of your testimonies have been under the assumption that the only difference between a papaya and a GM papaya
because I want the other council members to have a chance. And thank you so much. Aloha.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.